The Viet Cong who survived contact with them had a name for what they were fighting, and it was not the kind of nickname soldiers give an enemy out of grudging respect after the fact. Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, small teams of 4 and 5 men who left almost no trace on the ground they crossed, who killed at the highest ratio of any Australian unit to serve in the entire Vietnam War, and who did it while operating so far beyond the reach of support that a single broken ankle, a single missed radio check, could mean death with nobody close enough to know it had happened. 580 men wore that reputation across 5 years of war, patrolling in teams smaller than a suburban street's worth of neighbours, deep inside a province that swallowed larger forces without leaving a mark. Most Australians alive today have never heard of them. For a long time, most Australians alive at the time hadn't either, because a large part of what they actually did in Vietnam stayed classified for decades after the war itself had ended, kept from public view by a government that seemed to prefer silence to explanation. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard the name Ma Rung before today? Because by the time this story is finished, you will also know the name of a 23-year-old private who fell from a rope into that same jungle canopy and who was not found again for 39 years. Now let's go. To understand how a reconnaissance unit numbering only a few hundred men became one of the most feared Australian forces of the entire war, you first have to understand how Australia arrived in Vietnam at all. The comfortable version holds that Australia was drawn into the war almost reluctantly, a smaller ally following a larger one into a conflict of somebody else's making. The paper trail tells a more deliberate story. Australian involvement began in 1962, when the government of Robert Menzies committed 30 military advisors to a mission called the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, sent to train South Vietnamese forces under a policy its architects called forward defence. The conviction that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the dominoes behind it would eventually fall too. By 1965, that limited advisory commitment had become a fighting battalion, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, deployed to Viet Cong Province alongside American forces. And in 1966, under a Prime Minister who would soon promise the country would go all the way with its American ally, Australia sent something considerably larger again, a self-contained task force built around 2 infantry battalions, an artillery regiment, an armoured squadron, a cavalry squadron, and all the supporting arms that turn a collection of units into an army capable of holding ground on its own. It was named the 1st Australian Task Force, and it was based at a rubber-growing outpost called Nui Dat, in a province called Phuoc Tuy, that almost nobody in the Australian public had ever heard of before the soldiers landed. The province had been assigned to Australian control largely because it sat astride routes the Viet Cong needed to move supplies towards Saigon. It was not empty country waiting for outside forces to bring order to it. It had been fought over, in one form or another, for years before the first Australian soldier ever set foot there, and the mission the soldiers arrived believing in, largely reconstruction and the winning of hearts and minds among a rural population caught between 2 sides, would prove considerably harder to execute than the planning documents back in Canberra had suggested. The men who filled the ranks of that task force did not all arrive in Vietnam by the same road. Some were regular soldiers who had chosen the army as a career. A significant number of others were national servicemen, young Australian men selected by a birthday ballot, under a scheme introduced in 1964, conscripted into 2 years of military service, and, for many of them, a tour of Vietnam they had never volunteered for. The Special Air Service Regiment itself remained, throughout the war, a volunteer unit built around a demanding selection course. But national servicemen who passed that selection served alongside their regular army counterparts on exactly the same patrols, carrying exactly the same risk. That detail matters more than it might first appear, because one of the men whose story this documentary will return to later was among them. Buried inside that task force's order of battle was the Special Air Service Regiment. It had been formally raised on the 4th of September 1964 at Campbell Barracks in Perth, the successor to a smaller company-sized unit that had existed since 1957. Its purpose was reconnaissance in the strictest sense the word allows, to go where an infantry company could never go without being seen, and to come back with information instead of casualties. It did not arrive in Vietnam untested. Its first operational deployment had come the year before, when 1st Squadron served in Borneo from February to August of 1965 during the confrontation with Indonesia, followed by 2nd Squadron from February to July of 1966. Both squadrons conducting long-range jungle patrols and sensitive cross-border operations under rules of engagement. The Australian government would not publicly acknowledge for years afterward. It was, by the regiment's own later assessment, a valuable proving ground for what was still to come. On the 16th of June, 1966, the 3rd Squadron of the regiment arrived at Vung Tau, the coastal port that served as Australia's main logistics gateway into the province. The following day, the 17th of June, they moved inland to Nui Dat itself. They had no way of knowing, unpacking their kit into a base carved out of rubber plantation and red laterite dirt, that Phuoc Tuy would become the ground their entire reputation was built on. What the Special Air Service Regiment actually was, structurally, matters more to this story than any single commanding figure, because this is a story that belongs to a rotating cast of small units and quiet decisions made far from any headlines. 3 Sabre squadrons cycled through Vietnam between 1966 and 1971, each one completing 2 12-month tours before handing responsibility to the next. Integrated into the 1st and 2nd Squadrons were troops of the New Zealand Special Air Service, a genuine operational partnership. New Zealand soldiers patrolling, fighting, and on occasion dying under the same command structure as their Australian counterparts, indistinguishable in the patrol reports from the men beside them. The basic unit of operation was a patrol of 4 or 5 men, not as an upper limit before a mission escalated into something larger, but as the standard size for missions that could run a full week or more, entirely alone, deep inside territory the enemy considered its own. Getting into that patrol required passing through a selection process that had already developed its own brutal reputation within the Australian Army, built on exhaustion, isolation, and the deliberate testing of a soldier's judgment under conditions designed to strip away everything except whether he could be trusted, alone, days from the nearest friendly position, to make the right call. Men who failed did not fail because they lacked courage in any ordinary sense. They failed because the regiment was not actually selecting for courage. It was selecting for something harder to fake, the ability to stay quiet, stay patient, and keep thinking clearly, while every instinct in a frightened body screamed for noise and speed. Across the entire 5-year deployment, approximately 580 Australians served with the regiment in Vietnam. 2 men, neither of them famous in the way a battlefield commander might be, would eventually do more than anyone else to make sure this story was told once the classification around it finally lifted. David Horner became the regiment's official historian, and the book he eventually wrote gave the unit's Vietnam service the title history would remember it by, Phantoms of the Jungle, built from patrol reports and interviews conducted directly with the men who had lived them. Gary Mackay, a former infantry platoon commander who had himself been awarded the Military Cross for gallantry in Vietnam, spent years afterward collecting first-hand testimony from SAS veterans for a book he titled Sleeping with Your Ears Open. That title alone tells you something true about what this particular kind of war demanded of the men who fought it. Not the ability to sleep despite the danger, but the discipline to never fully let it go. Among the wider circle of Australian Special Forces trained soldiers serving in Vietnam during these same years was Ray Simpson, a warrant officer who had been posted to the original SAS company in November of 1957, before being selected for the Australian Army Training Team, the most highly decorated Australian unit of the entire war. In September of 1964, his patrol was ambushed at a position called Taco. Severely wounded in the leg and bleeding heavily, he held off repeated enemy assaults while calling for help by radio, an action that earned him the Distinguished Conduct Medal. 5 years later, on the 6th of May, 1969, commanding a Montagnard company near the Laos-Cambodia border in Kon Tum Province, Simpson ran under direct fire to rescue a wounded fellow warrant officer, and days later placed himself between wounded men and enemy fire to organise their evacuation, actions that earned him the Victoria Cross, Australia's highest award for gallantry, while attached to the training team rather than as a serving member of a Sabre squadron. His story runs parallel to the one this documentary tells rather than directly through it, but it belongs to the same world of small, quiet, exceptionally dangerous soldiering that produced everything that follows. None of that structure explains what a patrol into the jungle actually felt like from the inside. The regiment's own doctrine described its purpose in a phrase used officially and repeated by the men themselves. They were the eyes and the ears of the task force, operating not only across Phuoc Tuy, but at times into the neighbouring provinces of Bien Hoa, Long Khan, and Bin Tuy as well. A standard patrol went in by helicopter, dropped at a landing zone chosen to be well away from wherever the patrol actually intended to operate, and from there moved on foot, slowly, deliberately, communicating almost entirely by hand signal for days at a time without being detected. They located enemy bases. They tracked enemy movement along jungle trails invisible to anyone who hadn't spent months learning to read them. They counted strength, weapons, and direction of travel, radioing it back in brief. Coded transmissions kept as short as the information allowed, because every second of radio traffic was a second an enemy with the right equipment might use to fix their position. Then they extracted, ideally without a shot fired in either direction. Extraction under fire, what the men themselves simply called a hard extraction, was common enough that every patrol trained for it as a near certainty, because for a meaningful proportion of missions it happened anyway, and the regiment's own role description acknowledged as much. Their work ranged from quiet observation all the way up to offensive operations conducted deep inside territory the enemy considered entirely its own. Some patrols were mounted specifically as snatch patrols, sent to capture a single enemy soldier alive for interrogation, a mission demanding every ordinary skill of reconnaissance, plus the far more dangerous business of closing on an armed man quietly enough to take him before he could raise an alarm. The weapons a five-man patrol carried into that world were rarely the weapons the army had issued off the shelf. The regiment's own armourers modified rifles constantly, shortening barrels, removing flash hiders, altering magazine releases, turning standard issue equipment into something built for a five-man team that might need to convince a much larger enemy force it had walked into something bigger than it actually had. One modification earned its own name among the men who carried it. They called it the Bitch, a self-loading rifle with the barrel sawn down at the front sight post, a custom cone-shaped flash hider welded onto the shortened muzzle, the bipod stripped away. A pistol grip added for close, fast handling. It was louder than a standard rifle and threw a bigger, more violent muzzle flash, and both of those things were entirely deliberate. When a patrol made first contact, the point man would empty an entire magazine from the bitch in the opening seconds, and the sheer volume and light of it was often enough, on its own, to convince Viet Cong fighters they had stumbled into a much larger ambush, buying the patrol the few critical seconds it needed to break contact and vanish into terrain. It understood far better than whoever was chasing it. Nothing about that equipment did anything to soften the physical toll of the province itself. Phuoc Tuy's wet season brought monsoon rain that could last for days without a break, and leeches worked into boots and clothing on every patrol through the wet ground. None of it appeared in the kill counts that would later summarize this war in numbers. There was a second, far quieter war running underneath the one fought with rifles, and almost nobody in Vietnam knew it existed at the time. A unit called 547 Signal Troop had arrived at Nui Dat in April of 1966. 15 personnel at first, growing to 35 by the end of 1967. Their job was to listen. Not to patrol the jungle, but to intercept Viet Cong radio communications around the clock, identify enemy units by the call signs they used on air, and physically locate enemy transmitters through direction finding conducted from ground stations and aircraft. The secrecy surrounding their work was so total that many other Australian soldiers serving in the very same province never learned during their entire tour what 547 Signal Troop actually did all day. They were a world apart from the task force's own day-to-day communications unit, a much larger formation of more than 800 personnel that kept every company and battalion in the province connected by radio and telephone across the whole deployment, losing 3 of its own men killed in action along the way. One unit existed to be heard clearly by everyone who needed it. The other existed to never be noticed at all. The first time those two invisible wars, patrols on the ground and signallers on the radio, intersected in a way that would shape the entire Australian campaign, came within 2 months of the SAS's arrival in the summer of 1966. On the 25th of June, 1966, 3rd Squadron made its first contact with the enemy, a brief exchange of fire that told the newly arrived Australians little beyond the fact that Phuoc Tuy was occupied ground. Through July, their patrol range expanded steadily outward from Nui Dat, and the squadron began assembling a genuine picture of exactly who they were operating against. This was not contested by some loosely organised local militia. Phuoc Tuy was held, in significant part, by the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, a local force unit of roughly 350 to 380 men, that the task force itself would eventually assess as fighting close to a main force standard, and by elements of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment, part of the 5th Viet Cong Division, a force headquartered deep in the same Nui Mae Tao Mountains that would draw SAS patrols back again and again over the following 5 years. In late July and early August, the operators of 547 Signal Troop began picking up a marked increase in enemy radio traffic to the northeast of Nui Dat, the unmistakable signature of a significant force gathering and beginning to move. Whether the SAS patrols working the same ground independently detected the same build-up, or whether the warning reached the infantry first through the signals intercepts alone, remains, even in the regiment's own official history, a genuinely unresolved question, rather than the settled fact some retellings of this story have since claimed it to be. In the early hours of the 17th of August, the task force base itself came under mortar attack. Patrols were pushed out at first light to locate wherever the fire had come from. And on the 18th of August, 1966, in driving monsoon rain that turned the rubber plantation floor to mud, 108 men of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, walked into contact near Long Tan and found themselves fighting for their lives against a force that would eventually number somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. Artillery fired continuously from Nui Dat throughout the engagement, an average of roughly 20 rounds a minute, shells landing danger close to the Australian perimeter as the enemy pressed from multiple directions in the failing light and rain. Task Force Headquarters authorised a relief force late in the afternoon. B Company, already returning to base from an earlier patrol, was turned around and ordered to find D Company, while 10 armoured personnel carriers of the 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron left Nui Dat, carrying reinforcements from a company, fighting off a smaller Viet Cong group that tried to block their approach before pushing on. Overhead, helicopters from the Royal Australian Air Force's 9th Squadron ran ammunition resupply missions directly into the battle as stocks ran critically low on the ground. The relief force reached D Company just before darkness fell, and the Viet Cong broke off the attack and withdrew. 18 Australians were killed that afternoon. More than 245 enemy dead were counted in the aftermath, though the true total remains genuinely difficult to verify with real precision even now. Long Tan became, and to this day remains, the single most commemorated battle of Australia's entire involvement in Vietnam. 15 Commonwealth decorations were awarded to individual soldiers for their actions that day, and D Company itself received a United States Presidential Unit citation. For the Special Air Service Regiment, still less than 3 months into its very first tour, it was a brutal early lesson in exactly how much could still go wrong, even for men whose entire purpose was watching an enemy that was learning just as quickly how to hide from the people watching it. Every one of those patrols, contact or no contact, extracted the same quiet cost from the men who ran them. That isolation was, in its own way, the regiment's greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability at the same time. Long Tan was one battle, fought and finished in a single violent afternoon. What followed for the SAS was a war measured in months and years of patrols that mostly produced no headlines at all. The 1st Squadron began its own first tour when its main body arrived at Nui Dat on the 2nd of March 1967 under the command of Major Dale Burnett, and conducted its first operation on the 8th of March, running ambush and fighting patrols for 5 days that made no contact at all, an early reminder that most of this war would be fought in patience rather than gunfire. That November, the squadron took part in Operation Santa Fe, a joint operation combining Australian, American and South Vietnamese forces against a Viet Cong stronghold deep in the Nui Mae Tao Mountains. The same remote terrain that would matter again, in a very different way, 2 years later. By the time 1st Squadron's tour ended, in February of 1968, it had mounted 246 separate patrols, killed 83 Viet Cong by confirmed count with a further 15 recorded as possible kills, and handed over to 2nd Squadron a reputation the regiment itself was only beginning to fully understand it had earned. The character of that reputation began shifting deliberately in October of 1967, when Brigadier Hughes took command of the task force and made unmistakably clear that he wanted more from the SAS than pure reconnaissance. Hughes would later describe the kill rate the regiment was achieving as very gratifying, and said plainly that he did not see the SAS as an intelligence-gathering organisation, so much as a reaction force built on the intelligence other units gathered. Under that shift in philosophy, 2nd Squadron, arriving in February of 1968, conducted its first patrol on the 5th of March and had completed 29 patrols by the end of that month alone. That tempo did not hold steady. In May, with the helicopters that normally supported SAS missions diverted to help establish a new American fire support base in neighbouring Bien Hoa Province, the squadron's operations were confined to Phuoc Tuy, and its patrol count fell from 32 in April to just 12. Patrolling resumed at pace through June and July, and it was during that same stretch that the squadron began developing what the regiment called recce ambush patrols, missions that combined days of pure surveillance with a deliberately planned ambush at the conclusion, a genuine tactical evolution beyond doing one task or the other, but never both. 10-man fighting patrols, formed by combining 2 5-man teams, became a more frequent tool for engagements. The squadron anticipated would be heavier than a small team could safely handle. In one stretch of 1968, SAS soldiers provided close personal protection for Prime Minister John Gorton during a visit to Saigon, And in an operation nobody could have predicted from a unit built entirely around stealth, they strung fishing nets across a river during Operation Overboard and used them to physically snare a Viet Cong supply sampan slipping past in the dark. In October of 1968, Brigadier Cedric Pearson took command from Hughes and, by most accounts, brought a noticeably cooler enthusiasm for offensive operations. Under his command, the regiment's role reverted, at least partially, back toward pure intelligence gathering, though 2nd Squadron still closed out its first tour supporting the infantry during Operations Stellar Bright and Goodwood before rotating home that February. But the offensive period under Hughes had left something physical behind in the squadron lines at Nui Dat that a change of command could not immediately undo. Kills boards, tallies nailed up to record each squadron's confirmed enemy dead, a visible measure of success that sat increasingly uneasily against a founding doctrine that had always described the regiment's purpose as watching rather than killing. That reckoning came in February of 1969, when 3rd Squadron returned to Vietnam for its second tour, again under the command of Major Reginald Beasley, the same officer who had led 3rd Squadron's original first tour back in 1966, now returning 3 years later to command the same unit at a markedly different moment in its own history. Beasley's response to the kills boards he found still standing was not a written policy. He walked directly up to them and kicked them down. "We were not there to kill people, but to gain information," he said afterward, a sentence short enough to have fit on one of the boards he had just destroyed, but carrying considerably more weight than anything ever chalked up on them. Under his command, 3rd Squadron's second tour deliberately re-emphasized reconnaissance over ambush, concentrating its patrols around the Nui Mai Tao Mountains in the province's remote northeast, terrain so difficult and so far beyond the reach of the task force's artillery that it had become one of the enemy's most secure base areas in the entire province. Thick double canopy jungle rising into genuine high ground, where a patrol in trouble could not count on the same fire support that covered most of the rest of Phuoc Tuy. The slow, unglamorous intelligence those patrols gathered built, piece by piece, towards something concrete. In December of 1969, the 6th Battalion, reinforced by its integrated New Zealand company, launched a month-long operation to finally clear the Nui Mai Tao Mountains, an operation whose eventual success was owed directly to information the SAS had spent the better part of a year collecting, without firing most of the shots that ultimately mattered. The same commander, the same squadron, 3 years apart, first present at the war's most genuinely ambiguous intelligence question, and now delivering the regiment's clearest ethical correction to itself. But information gathered quietly still had to be physically carried out of the jungle by human beings, and in September of that same year, one patrol very nearly did not make it out at all. Private David John Elkington Fisher was 23 years old, a national serviceman from Balgowlah Heights in New South Wales, serving with 3rd Squadron on a patrol that should, by the ordinary run of things, have been one of the last of his tour. For 7 days beginning around the 20th of September, 1969, his patrol moved through persistent, unrelenting rain in southeastern Long Khan Province, roughly 30 kilometers northeast of Nui Dat, fighting a series of sharp sudden contacts with Viet Cong groups that left them outnumbered and pursued through terrain that gave the enemy every advantage. On the 27th of September, they called for an emergency extraction. The helicopters arrived within roughly half an hour, close enough behind the request that the enemy was still closing on the patrol's position as the aircraft came in low over the canopy. What followed was a hot extraction in the fullest, most literal sense the term allows. The patrol clipped their carabiners onto ropes dangling beneath the helicopter, while gunships worked overhead to suppress the enemy fire rising from the tree line below, the aircraft lifting the men clear of the jungle under direct threat, exactly the kind of extraction every patrol trained for and hoped. every single time, never to actually need. As the helicopter gathered speed and began climbing away from the contact, the rest of the patrol realized that Fisher was no longer on his rope. He had fallen from a height of roughly 30 meters back down into the dense jungle canopy. Most likely, investigators would conclude decades later, after misclipping his carabiner in the noise and pressure of the moment. A 10-man SAS ground search began that same afternoon, reinforced within hours by infantry from a supporting rifle company. Men who understood exactly what they were looking for, and exactly how small the odds of finding it grew with every hour that passed over broken, densely forested terrain that had already swallowed the sound of a falling body without a trace. They searched for 6 days straight, working outward from the extraction point in expanding patterns, checking ground the enemy still actively contested. They found nothing. Fisher was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, 2 months short of completing his tour, and for the next 39 years his family had no body to bury, and no confirmed account of what had actually happened to their son in the seconds after he fell. That figure, 39 years, is not one to move past quickly. It spans the entire remaining course of the Vietnam War, the eventual fall of Saigon, the complete withdrawal of every Australian soldier from the country, and the greater part of a generation growing up in an Australia that had, by the time real answers finally arrived, largely stopped talking about the war at all. In January of 2008, a specialist Australian Army program called Unrecovered War Casualties reopened the long-dormant investigation into Fisher's disappearance. Investigators eventually located a Vietnamese witness who recalled, from decades earlier, finding and quietly burying the body of a man he had believed at the time to be a dead American soldier, near a creek known locally as the Soi Sap. Fisher, like most SAS soldiers operating in Vietnam, had worn American pattern camouflage rather than standard-issue Australian uniform, a detail that had, for 39 years, obscured his true identity from the very people who might otherwise have been able to identify him decades sooner. Combined with a careful recalculation of the helicopter's exact flight path in the seconds before Fisher fell, that witness account gave investigators a search location considerably more precise than anything the original 1969 effort had ever established. In August of 2008, a recovery team located human remains at the site. On the 11th of September 2008, those remains were positively identified as belonging to Private David Fisher. In October of that year, 39 years after he fell from a rope into the jungle canopy of Long Can Province, he was finally repatriated to Australia and laid to rest with full military honours, the very last Australian serviceman missing from the entire Vietnam War to finally be brought home. Fisher's loss did not end the war in Phuoc Tuy. By 1970, after nearly 4 years of Australian helicopter insertion patterns repeated across hundreds of missions, Viet Cong forces in the province had grown familiar enough with SAS methods that patrols were increasingly fired on within minutes of landing, sometimes before the men on the ground had even reached cover. The regiment's answer, introduced from June of 1970, was a technique the men called the cowboy insertion. A second helicopter, following close behind the first, would insert a second patrol alongside the original team, both patrols moving together for roughly 5 minutes before splitting apart, one continuing toward its actual mission, while the second held position, and then, if no contact developed, returned openly to the landing zone. The whole maneuver was a deliberate piece of misdirection, built to confuse an enemy who had spent 4 years learning to watch the sky for exactly the pattern the SAS had relied on. 1st Squadron's second tour, beginning on the 18th of February 1970, found a province where enemy activity was noticeably decreasing, some patrols going months without a single sighting. Through March and April, the squadron patrolled the approaches to the Nui Mai Tao Mountains and inserted long-range patrols into neighbouring Binh Tuy Province, ground the SAS had barely touched in the war's earlier, more contact-heavy years. By the time 2nd Squadron arrived for its own second tour in February of 1971, deploying 23 patrols within its first month, the enemy had largely withdrawn from the interior of Phuoc Tuy altogether, retreating toward the province's outer borders, and SAS patrolling shifted into neighbouring Long Khan Province and the Courtney rubber plantation area. Intelligence gathered during those later patrols directly shaped Operation Iron Fox in July of 1971, a large operation conducted jointly by the 3rd and 4th Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. By 1971, American policy across South Vietnam had shifted decisively toward what Washington called Vietnamisation, the gradual handover of the war to South Vietnamese forces, and Australian policy followed the same direction. That August, the Australian government formally announced that the entire task force would be withdrawn from Vietnam before Christmas. The regiment's very last patrol of the war ran from the 1st to the 5th of October, 1971. It made no contact with the enemy at all. After 5 years of ambush, pursuit, and a reputation earned one patrol at a time, the SAS's war in Vietnam ended not with a final dramatic battle, but with 5 quiet days of nothing. When the full cost of those 5 years was finally tallied, the numbers told their own story, though never the entirety of it. Across the complete deployment, roughly 580 Australians served with the Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam, conducting 1,175 patrols of their own, alongside a further 130 mounted separately by the integrated New Zealand SAS troops. Australian losses across that entire 5-year span totaled 1 soldier killed in action, 1 who later died of his wounds, 3 killed in accidents rather than combat, 1 missing. Fisher eventually recovered 39 years later, and 1 death from illness, alongside 28 men wounded in action. Set against those losses, the Australian War Memorial's own official assessment credits SAS and New Zealand SAS patrols, together with 492 confirmed enemy killed, a further 106 recorded as possible kills, 47 enemy wounded, 10 more possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners taken alive. Figures that represent, by the memorial's own stated assessment, the highest kill ratio achieved by any Australian unit across the entire war. It is worth saying plainly, though, that kill counts generated from small unit contact reports fought inside dense jungle terrain are, by their very nature, difficult for anyone to verify with real precision, then or now. Counting the Borneo years alongside the Vietnam deployment, the regiment's own later accounting put its combined patrol total across both campaigns above 1,400, reporting on more than 5,600 enemy movements and accounting for more than 500 enemy killed across some 298 separate contacts. A body of work built almost entirely by men operating in groups smaller than most suburban football teams. What those numbers cannot capture at all is the work of 547 Signal Troop, whose role in intercepting enemy radio communications remained officially secret for decades after the war had ended, hidden so thoroughly that even many of the soldiers they had directly helped to protect never learned the unit existed until long after they had come home themselves. It would take David Horner's official history, published in 1989, and Gary Mackay's collection of first-hand veteran testimony a decade later, to finally bring the regiment's full Vietnam story to an Australian public that had, for the most part, spent close to 30 years not knowing most of it at all. This was never really a cover-up in the dramatic sense that word usually implies to a modern audience. It was the standard, largely unglamorous secrecy that surrounds special forces and signals intelligence work in almost every country that conducts it. But the practical effect on the public record was the same regardless of the underlying reason for it. An entire generation of Australians grew up without knowing that a unit called Ma Rung had ever existed, or what it had actually cost the men inside it to earn a name like that from an enemy who meant it as something closer to fear than to flattery. Some of that story is still being written even now. Fisher's repatriation in 2008 was part of a broader Australian Army program that, between 2007 and 2009, successfully recovered the remains of the last 6 Australian servicemen still officially listed as missing from the entire Vietnam War. The regiment's Vietnam-era doctrine of small unit, long-range reconnaissance, refined patrol by patrol through 5 years in Phuoc Tuy Province, fed forward into Special Forces doctrine well beyond Australia's own borders. And the reputation the regiment earned in that one province became, in time, the foundation for everything the unit went on to become afterward. When the SAS involvement in Vietnam finally ceased that October, 2nd Squadron itself was disbanded, its personnel and structure absorbed into what would become the regiment's ongoing support and training establishment, a quiet administrative footnote that nonetheless marked the formal close of the unit's longest sustained combat commitment in its history. Through the 1970s, the Special Air Service Regiment was reshaped into Australia's premier counter-terrorist force, called on in the years that followed, for operations stretching from Somalia to Kuwait to East Timor, and eventually to securing an Olympic Games held on Australian soil in the year 2000. Nothing in that later history erased what had come before it. If anything, the discipline the regiment had built one patrol at a time in Phuoc Tuy Province, the patience, the restraint Beasley had once demanded with his boot against a wooden board, became the exact foundation everything afterward was built on. Back in Australia, the war these men were fighting had by the early 1970s become one of the most politically divisive in the country's history. Popular memory of Australia's war in Vietnam, when it did surface in the decades that followed, rarely reached down into a story as narrow and classified as the SS's. The name Ma Rung endures in public memory today largely because 2 men eventually chose, deliberately and carefully, to write the real story down, rather than because it was ever handed to the Australian public freely or quickly by the institutions that had lived it. It is also worth saying plainly, given how this particular story sometimes circulates now, that the internet age has occasionally taken the regiment's genuine, well-documented reputation and stretched it into something more dramatic than the actual historical record supports, adding specifics and incidents that no primary source can confirm ever happened. The truth, told carefully and without embellishment, was never short of extraordinary to begin with. It never needed the invention to earn the name it already had. What the Viet Cong actually meant when they called this unit Phantoms of the Jungle was never really about anything supernatural. It was about the particular, disciplined terror of an enemy who moved without being seen, struck without meaningful warning, and disappeared again before anyone could organize a response large enough to matter. But the men who carried that reputation were never truly ghosts, whatever the enemy who feared them chose to call them. They were flesh and blood, trained for years, sent into a war most of them never chose, and asked to carry a silence that outlasted the fighting itself by decades. They were watched for, listened for, tracked by radio and by rumour across 5 patient years of jungle warfare, and in at least one case, waited for, patiently and without resolution, across nearly 4 full decades, by a family that had nothing to bury and no way of knowing their son's true fate until the year 2008 finally, quietly gave it back to them. Somewhere inside the classified files that took 30 years to open, in the patient, unglamorous listening work of a signals unit almost nobody in Vietnam ever knew existed, and in one commander's decision to walk up to a board with a number chalked on it and simply kick it down, is a truer version of this story than any legend built to sell itself on volume alone ever could be. If you had never heard the name Ma Rung or the name David Fisher before watching this, let us know in the comments below. And if you want to understand what it actually took to fight a war where the single most valuable weapon a soldier carried was his own silence, watch this next.